It's good to see each and every one of you. Thankful for your attendance tonight. I hope that our time together is edifying and encouraging. The subject at hand, indeed, was just stated, is really it's important. And the more I have studied it over the last couple months, having been given the topic very early, which I'm thankful, has really been beneficial to me, and I hope it is to you as well. I want to say a few things as we begin. First is tomorrow night, of course, is 4th of July celebration. It'll be at our house. If you are planning to come, please bring your own lawn chair. Please bring your own lawn chair. We'll say it a third time. Please bring your own lawn chair. You guys are good. Bring your own lawn chair. Okay. Bring insect repellent. We live out in the country near a lot of water, and there are mosquitoes. I did spray yesterday for all kinds of fun insects, but we do live in the country, so bring insect repellent if you so choose. If you don't, I can't guarantee you won't get carried off. So we're going to have a good time, and I'm looking forward to everyone being there. I would also say as we begin how thankful I am to this congregation. And every time I speak here, I'm so encouraged and strengthened by you, and I appreciate that. Not all places are like here, and we are blessed here. And you are the reason. And our family truly loves you, and we pray for you on a daily basis. In God's created material universe, the world, the universe around us, there are ordinances, things ordained by God that are expressed every day. For example, you could see this clearly from Scripture in Psalm chapter 19. The rising and the setting of the sun as a man going forth is very clear, right? We know, and we can actually count time based upon the sun. Here recently there was an eclipse, and scientists knew of the eclipse years in advance because of the ordinances, not of man, and not because of the scientific findings of man, but because of the order of our God. We serve a God of order. We serve a God that puts things in place, and listen, He keeps them in place. And I think if there is ever a great argument for the existence of God, it might be that fact. When you read about God who cannot change, does not change, many of these things that He has spun into place, He keeps in place. Think about all these scientific things that we think we find, but yet God has been governing them by law, His law, meticulously for eons. And all of God's universe is governed by God's ordained authority. Weights, measurements. I don't know if you know this. Anybody fish? Anybody like to fish? I like to fish. Anybody keep records of their fish? I've got a whole file on my phone. If you start talking about fish, I'll click on an album and it will pop up and it'll have pictures of all the fish my family and I have caught together in various places around the world. That we love fishing. And I don't know if you know this about the rules for fishing and weighing a fish to be properly weighed as a record. So say you catch a giant fish and you're out on a boat and you weigh it. And you think, man, I have won a record. This thing is going to beat all the records. It's the biggest fish. And you get back to land, and they go to weigh that fish, and it doesn't weigh what it weighed on the boat. Did you know that fish don't weigh the same on land as they do on boat? It's literally, it's a real thing. It's actually something ordered by God. And they don't allow you to weigh record fish on a boat because as the boat moves in the water, so does the gravitational pressure upon the fish, and thus it can't be used as a standardized weight set Pretty interesting. You know who set that in place? Who ordered? God did. And the same divine and inherent authority that is ordained is found in social order and in human life as well. There is inherent in society law and order. You know who put it there? God. God put it there. It's ordained from above. In fact, the very machinery of civil order, civil government, is one of the best examples by which we can look at how God orders our life on a daily basis. You think about how our life in every way is changed and governed by law. I was driving here tonight and a car went flying past me. He got right up on my tail first, actually. I was passing a vehicle and he got right up on me. And I was going the speed limit. And he was real frustrated. You could tell because he was doing this behind me. And then his lights messed up. I don't know. Like he started flashing them. I don't know. Finally, I got out of his way and whoa, boy, sped past me. And I thought, you know what's going to happen up here in a couple miles? I'm going to pass that guy again, but he's going to have lights flashing at him. Why? We know that our lives are governed by civil law in every way. Everything we do, essentially, we know that there are laws governing them. And all of this world is a manifestation of the carefully ordered law and government of God. Even Job recognized this. You read in Job chapter 38, and we're not going to go there. We don't have time. But essentially the argument is made by God to Job. Where were you when I put all of this in order? Where were you when I put the hail in the clouds and the snow in the sky? Where were you when I put the trenches in the ocean and I did everything in creation? Where were you? I ordered that. So that's God's argument to Job. I did that. And so we need order. And when you discuss the powers that be, being ordained of God, we need to understand that this is not a new concept. We see it from the very beginning in the home, don't we? We see God ordering the home. He sets up this plan for the home, this parental domestic home authority. It is constituted and ordained and governed by God. He created male and female. Male and female, He created them. And He put them together and He says what? Be fruitful, multiply. One man for one woman for life. We know, right? He made this law and He put it into place and it has not changed. Why? Because God put it there. And God has governed the home ever since. You think about in the book of Exodus, for example, the fifth commandment being to do what? Honor thy father and mother, that it may be well with thee and that thou mayest live long upon the earth. And the Apostle Paul would reiterate this in the book of Ephesians chapter 6, where he tells the children to obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. What is he doing? He is governing the home. God has always been a God of order. You think about the home, you think about fathers. He says, fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. You think about the relationship of the husband to the wife. Fathers, the husbands are to love their wives even as Christ loved the church. And so there is this divine order that God has in place for the home. You think about the church itself. God has put in place order for it. Because God is not going to leave us ungoverned. Every part of what God has always done has been governing, in a sense. And certainly in the church there is a government. You think about the 13th chapter of the book of Hebrews. 3 times in one chapter we are reminded, and being a letter being written to the Jewish Christians, those that had converted out of Judaism into Christianity, they're being reminded to remember them which have the rule over you. Verse 7. 17th chapter. Obey them. Or 17th verse. Obey them that have the rule over you. Submit yourselves to them, for they watch over your souls. You think in verse 24 and 25, salute them that have the rule over you. Is there not a reiteration here of the fact that there is some form of governance in the church? That there are those that have a rule over you, and who put them there? God did. You might be saying, man, he's taken a long time to get to Romans chapter 13. Bear with me. I'm firmly of the belief of Curtis Cates that I think we went, 28 weeks before we even got to the book of Acts when we studied it with him. Book fitly introduced is pretty much done. God has always been a God of government. He's been a God of order. When we think about the term anarchy, what comes to mind? You might think of the symbol of anarchist, right? Think of the circle and the A, and you might think of people maybe wearing a white mask and acting like hooligans. Anarchy has never been a part of God's plan. Never left us in an anarchist state. Matter of fact, every time God works with a group of people, He always gives them order. And anarchy is a complete diametrical opposite to that. And so God wants us to be ordered. I'm going to give you one more thought to consider before we really dive into the text of Romans 13. And it's a principle that we need to understand, and it's this, that there is a difference. There's a difference between a man and a man's office. You're going to understand it all when we put all these pieces together here in a second. But there is a difference between a man and a man's office. There's a difference between President Biden and the office of the presidency. I want you to hold on to that thought because we're going to come back to it in a minute. A man can be a rascal. He can be villainous. He can be wicked. He can pursue in the course of his time in civil authority iniquity. He can be a reproach to all people and those who elect him or put him in place, even the one through whose providence might put him there. But the office the man holds, and I want you to catch this, that's what's ordained of God. We're going to notice this in a second, but I want you to get this. The office is what is ordained of God. Now, there are accounts and historical episodes where God does ordain certain people for certain roles, and there is absolutely no doubt about that. We're going to look at those. But when God here in Romans chapter 13 now, He says, I want every one of you to submit yourselves to the higher powers. For the powers that be ordained of God. These higher powers being an office, not just a man. I want you to notice a couple things tonight about government and the powers that be being ordained of God. I want you to notice first that they are ordained of God to be under God's control. When government is there, it is for the purpose of being under, to submit to God's control. Now, having studied this, there is a wealth of material on this. If you want material, I could give you material for years to read. Matter of fact, I believe this, I did read, earlier today, that this might be the most highly written about text from our New Testament dating back to AD 55, is Romans 13. I would have never thought that. I would have thought it might have been on the subject of baptism or the church. No, Romans 13. And I want you to think about why that might be the case. When Paul wrote this to the Christians in Rome, telling them to submit to those higher powers, who was Caesar? Nero. Submit to Nero? There was a lot to be said. You go into the 2nd century, and Origen and Tertullian, they write a lot about it, and when you read their writings, they're pretty much in consensus with what we would teach today. You get to the 3rd century, though, and you have a man come to be in power as Caesar named Constantine. And he takes on role as Caesar, but he converts to Christianity, in my opinion, in a ply to gain more power. But now he is going to take Romans chapter 13 and use this and weaponize it. He's going to take it and say, see, the Bible says you have to do everything I say. It says submit yourselves to the higher powers. You got to do what I say. And so, man, it really started to be a subject that was written about, studied about, and they even had special councils about this very passage here, Romans 13, 1 through 7. Fast forward, and you have this period from the 300s up until about 1500, where you have this whole world of the papacy, the Catholic Church ruling the world, and they are using and weaponizing Romans chapter 13 to say that that's actually the powers that be that are ordained of God would be the Catholic Church, and therefore you have to obey us. Enter Martin Luther. Martin Luther comes to the scene and he says, not anymore. Right? Nailing that 99 thesis on the door. And Martin Luther would make the argument that this wasn't applicable to the Catholic Church, but rather civil government. And you think even in the last century. Hitler argued that the Germans that lived under his rule had to submit to him because, and he used the argument from Romans chapter 13. Think about what's happened in the last 100 years in South Africa. And those that were part of the Reformed Church of South Africa used Romans 13 as an argument to keep people under bondage. And so this is a very heavily discussed topic. Oh, and I kind of overshot one there on purpose. Tomorrow we celebrate a day called the 4th of July. The Declaration of Independence was signed, and we declared our independence from England, from the crown. And there's a lot of discussion on whether or not we actually had the right to do that under God's law or not, and thus it was written about. Matter of fact, the most highly written about subject for the 50 years before and 50 years after the Revolutionary War, religiously, was Romans 13. Was it justified? Was it something we could do? And so it's something that needs talked about. And when we understand that these things that are ordained of God are under His control, we need to be asking ourselves, if God ordains it, what is my responsibility towards it? And what is the government that is put in place by God or ordained by God, set up in order by God? What is their responsibility? Let's get a picture of this under God's control, this ordained idea. The word ordained here in Romans chapter 13, it's a prolonged word in the Greek, of a very short word actually in the Greek, but it's the way it's written, it's prolonged, and it's the word tasso in the Greek. The shortened version is, and it means to set in place of. And in the tense that it is, it's have been and remains in force. So it's something that God has always done. He ordained these higher powers. God has always ordained higher powers. There's always been government, and there always will be government. So get this picture. When He says ordained, He's not talking about one specific person. Remember, the office is more than just the man. And so He says that here is this government, and government's always going to be, because I'm a God of order, and therefore there's always going to be order. I'm setting that in place. The powers that be, they are ordained. They're set in place of by God forever. There's always going to be a need for order. There's 8 different times in our New Testament that this word is used. One of the easiest to help us understand its usage is in Luke chapter 7 and verse 8, where the text says, He says, I am a man set under authority, having under me soldiers. And so here is a soldier saying, I have been given an appointment, a position. I've been set. And so God set in place higher powers. He's ordained them. So the Apostle Paul, he would use the word ordain. Daniel would use the word ordain as well, or to set, as it might be translated in Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 20, Daniel would say, "Blessed be the name of God forever, for wisdom and might are His, and He changeth the time and the seasons. He removeth kings," and now listen, "and He setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding." And so here you have this idea of being set up or ordained again, appointed. J.W. McGarvey would argue for this idea of it being translated set up. God has set up a system of order, and so we're to follow that order. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 13, another way you could look at this would be the way Peter would write of it, and it says there in Verse 13, he says, "I want you to submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be as to king, as supreme, or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by Him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well." Notice that Peter would use the terminology that they are sent by God. So you have Paul ordained or set up, Daniel set up, you have Peter, they are sent. Jesus in John 19 and verse 11, as He is discussing with Pilate, and Jesus would answer Pilate, and He says that thou couldst have no power at all against me except it were given thee from above. And so Jesus would use the terminology, it's given. Completely different word, but the same concept. That these things that are ordained of God, these higher powers, these positions, Pilate only had his power because God gave it to him, is what Jesus says. It's the only reason you can do what you're doing. It's the only reason you're in the place you're in is because God established order and you're sitting in a place of power within that order. And so we need to understand then that real power only comes from God. If we get anything from the text tonight, get this. Real power only comes from God. There are so many people today that are power hungry. I mean, I'm going to dive off into politics for a second, so just forgive me if you would. Does anybody else find it hard to believe that the two men we have running for president are the two best men we have in our country? One can't spell his name and the other one can't look past his own name. Power. It's about power. People are consumed with themselves. And Jesus tells Pilate, you only have power because my Father lets you have power. You are only in this position because my Father lets you be in this position. Again, Daniel, in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 17, he would say this. He says, "This is the matter by the decree of the watchers and demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and," here we go, "giveth it to whomsoever He will, and setteth it up over the basest of men." When you consider the history of human affairs from the beginning of time, you cannot come away looking at history and not recognize that God has had a divine plan with every government that's ever existed. God has had a plan. You think about men like Cyrus, Sennacherib, Pilate. You think about Alexander the Great. You think about Pharaoh himself. Has God not had a plan? In Jeremiah chapter 27 and verse 5, well, you go back to verse 4, and it says, "And command them to say unto their masters, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Thus you shall say unto your masters, I made the earth, the man and the beast that are upon the ground, by my great power, by my outstretched hand, have," here we go, "given it to them, and to whom it seemed meet to me. And now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant." You mean Nebuchadnezzar was a servant of God? God said he was. God used Nebuchadnezzar. He used the office of Nebuchadnezzar, didn't he? He used that as an occasion. You think back to Daniel chapter 6, when Daniel is thrown in the lion's den. He's brought out after all of that occasion. We know the story. And he's brought out, and we often stop right there. What happens at the end, though? What does the king do? He says, I declare, I want a message sent out to the whole kingdom that the God of Daniel is the God of the universe. What did God use? An ordained position to now spread His message throughout the world. So God would use the word given. I've given it. But for what purpose? If the powers that be, and these are certainly, no doubt, those in government, as Peter would say, as king supreme or governor, these powers, what is their purpose? If God ordains them and they're under His control, the position is, God, listen, if God doesn't want you to be president, will you be president? Let's grapple with this for a second and get over it. If God doesn't want you to be president, will you be president? And the answer is no. And if God wants you to be, will you be? Yes. And God has always operated that way. And He will use what He needs as tools for His purposes to do good. Sometimes it's to punish, and that's what the text is going to say, right? To carry out punishment or to do good. So what is the purpose of these divinely ordained positions and roles? During the regime of the Nazis in the 40s, there's a name you would probably recognize, the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a Lutheran pastor in Germany that was eventually killed by Adolf Hitler because he resisted, through his preaching and teaching, Adolf's work. He wrote this, and I think it's beneficial to note. He said, the mission of government is to serve Christ, or the mission of government to serve Christ is at the same time its inescapable destiny. Government serves Christ no matter whether it is conscious or unconscious of this mission, or even whether it is true or untrue to it. If it is unwilling to fulfill this mission, then through the suffering of the congregation, it renders service to the witness of the name of Christ. It can not, in either case, evade its task of serving Christ. It serves Him by its very existence. God has always ordained order. And I started with the concept of order, and I want to finish with it because I believe it is the single and sole purpose that God puts government in. The higher powers, these powers that be, are there for order. Now we're going to sub under this. We're going to jump down one. For the goal of the spread of the gospel. And I want you to think about this. We often get so bent out of shape when we hear maybe of the suppression of speech in America. You know, they're trying to shut down Christians from maybe preaching or teaching or maybe practicing their faith the way that they understand from Scripture, and we get really upset about it. And, oh man, the government's, come and take it, right? We're Americans and you can't do anything about it, and we're going to live the way we want. And I want you to reconsider that mindset for a minute, because I believe that's what Paul is encouraging us to do. I want you to consider the audience to which Paul, by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, wrote. A group of people living in a city which had already cast out most of the Jews, telling them, encouraging them to submit themselves to the higher powers, for they be ordained of God. Why would I submit myself to them? I want you to go to verse 4, and I'm going to jump into probably somebody else's text, but I'm going to do it just a moment and come back out. He says, "For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause, pay you tribute also, pay your taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually unto this very thing. Render therefore all to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law." Now let's jump back one chapter to Romans chapter 12. And as Paul begins a section, and Romans 13 is in a section, a greater context. Romans chapter 12 really begins that and starts it off, where Paul would encourage the brethren there at Rome to live differently than the world. He says, "I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind." Now listen, "that you may prove that that is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." What does it do every time when someone is persecuted and yet they stay the course? When they're persecuted and they don't bend, they don't bow, and they don't break, like Shadrach and the others there, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Sorry, I got way overheated yesterday. My brain is just now coming on tonight. What happens? What does it do to those that see us living godly, not resisting, not being, pound my chest and say, "Come and take it," but rather saying, "You know what, I'm willing to subject myself through some things for the purpose of showing what is the good and the perfect and the acceptable will of God." What is it showing everybody else? Why did the early church grow by leaps and bounds? People saw people living out Christianity and they wanted to be a part of it. When the early church was persecuted in Acts chapter 8, what happened? Did the church shrink or did the church grow? The church grew. Why? They saw that there was something real happening. Something worth holding on to, worth happening. When God ordains these higher powers and asks us to be subject to them, He is asking us to do something for the furtherance of the gospel, and that is the purpose of the law and order which is set forth by God in this ordination. When He sets up these things, when He gives them this power, and we subject ourselves, hupotasso, to put ourselves under, what we're doing is we're showing the rest of the world that it's not about me, but it's about something far greater than me. I'm willing to give up personal liberty for Christ. Are you? See, that's what Paul did, and that's what he wrote for them to do. He gave up personal liberty for the cause of Christ. Would you? Would I be willing to give it up? Well, we live in America. This is the land of the free and the home of the brave. And this is a country founded upon godly principles. Yeah, that's true. Would you give that up for the cause of Christ? See, God ordained these things. He put them in place. I love this concept of trusting God. It's hard to trust God sometimes when things aren't going our way, right? When it's not what I want, it's a little harder to trust God in what He's doing, what He's working out in my life. And so I'm like, man, I just don't know about this. It's really easy when it seems like God is on the same path as I am, right? I like that. When God's on the same path as me, that's great. And I hope you heard the backwardness of my statement just now. When God is on my path, wait. What are we asking for there? Very selfish, isn't it? But when I learn to trust God in His provision, when I learn to trust in His perspective, see, God's ways are higher than our ways. I don't see the same as God. God looketh on the inward man of the heart, as He would tell those there when David was being anointed king. He sees things from a bird's eye view when I don't see it. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be Daniel? He's just been hauled as a youth from his homeland, and now he's gone to another country. And all of a sudden, a few years later, he's kind of climbed the ladder, if you would. He's gained respect and honor, as he should have. And then all of a sudden, everybody's kind of against him, making a law that says you can't pray to any other god save the king. What does Daniel do? He goes back to his room, being in an upper chamber, Daniel chapter 6 and verse 10. And he opens his window to the east, and he prays to his God 3 times a day, as he did aforetime. And I bring this up because it flies in what would seem on the surface in the face of what I've just discussed about God ordaining these things, and thus we need to submit to the government. And here's Daniel, and what is he not doing? He's not submitting. But I want to call to remembrance a phrase that was said. It says, for conscience sake. Daniel could not serve his God. And sometimes that's going to bring about repercussions that we're going to have to pay for. And Daniel was completely okay with that. He knew the repercussions. And he boldly goes to his room, gets down on his knees, he raises the window, and he prays 3 times a day. Why? Because he knew the God that put those people in those positions was the same God that could take him out of the lion's den whole. And if he didn't, he would be with him whole in heaven. And he knew that. And when we submit ourselves to anyone else, whether it's the slave to a master relationship that Peter's going to talk about, whether it is employee to employer, whether it's child to parent, wife to husband, congregation to an eldership, whatever relationship it be where we have to submit ourselves up under someone else, what we are doing is saying we trust God that He does all things right. Brethren, we serve a God that does all things right. When He sets up, when He gives power, when He ordains government, He does right. And it may not be from our perspective that we see it. But have you ever had that moment in life where you can look back down through the periscope of time and see things, how they worked out in your life, and go, man, I really missed it when I was 16 years old. I've had plenty of those moments. Kind of those moments that your father tells you about that you're going to, remember someday. I've had those moments. I'm sure you have too. It's because our perspective isn't in a high enough place. So what we have to do is trust. If God ordains it, we trust Him. We follow His lead. He says, submit yourselves to every ordinance of the higher powers. And that's what we do. Because He set them up, and He's in control. And you read that last book of our Bible, the book of Revelation. What's the theme of the book of Revelation? Victory. See, we win because He's already won. And we just have to trust that He is going to make all things, go back to chapter 8 now, verse 28, work together for good to those that love Him. May we trust God enough to follow whatever, however, whenever, and wherever. Thank you.